Power doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It sits quietly in filing cabinets, sleeps in legal documents, waits in signature lines that people never bother to read. For 23 years, I carried the weight of a secret that could reshape everything, and nobody, not my husband, not his precious secretary, not the board members who treated me like decorative furniture, bothered to ask the right questions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 52 years old. Until 6 weeks ago, I thought I understood the rules of the game I'd been playing for over 2 decades. I thought loyalty was currency, that standing by your husband through thick and thin would eventually pay dividends. I thought that building something together meant sharing power, not just responsibilities. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was absolutely right about one thing that mattered more than all the rest combined. The morning it all started to unravel began like any other Tuesday in March. I woke up in our king-sized bed, in the house I'd helped design, in the neighborhood I'd chosen, next to the man I'd supported through law school, through the lean years of building his practice, through every triumph and setback of the past 23 years. Robert was already up, as usual, his side of the bed cold and perfectly made. He'd been an early riser since we were young, back when I found his ambition attractive instead of exhausting. I could hear the shower running in our master bathroom, could smell the expensive coffee brewing downstairs that our housekeeper Maria had started before she arrived. The routine was so familiar it felt like breathing. In 30 minutes, Robert would emerge from the bathroom, hair perfectly styled, wearing one of the suits I'd helped him select from Brooks Brothers. He'd kiss my forehead absently while scrolling through his phone, grab his coffee and briefcase, and disappear into his BMW for the 40-minute drive to downtown Phoenix. Mitchell & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming office building on Central Avenue. The law firm specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes deals that made headlines in the business section and generated the kind of fees that had bought us our house in Paradise Valley, our cabin in Flagstaff, and the comfortable life I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Robert had built something impressive, no doubt about it. What he'd conveniently forgotten was that he hadn't built it alone. I padded downstairs in my silk robe, the one Robert had given me for my 50th birthday, along with a lecture about how I should take better care of myself, maybe consider personal training again. The kitchen was already spotless, Maria having worked her usual magic. She'd been with us for 8 years, a quiet woman from Guadalajara, who cleaned our house, managed our schedules, and pretended not to notice the growing distance between Robert and me. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly, not looking up from the breakfast she was preparing. Maria had an uncanny ability to make herself invisible when the tension in our house grew thick, which had become more frequent in recent months. "Morning, Maria. Just coffee for me today, please." She nodded and poured me a cup from the French press, adding the splash of cream she knew I preferred. I settled at the kitchen island with my laptop, ostensibly to check emails, but really to maintain the illusion that I had somewhere important to be, something pressing to accomplish. The truth was that my days had become increasingly empty since our youngest child, Emma, had left for college 3 years ago. For 20 years, I'd been the perfect corporate wife. I'd hosted dinner parties for Robert's colleagues and clients, charmed potential partners at charity galas, managed our household so seamlessly that Robert never had to think about dry cleaning or grocery shopping, or whether we had enough wine for entertaining. I'd raised 2 children largely on my own while he worked 12-hour days building his empire. I'd been his cheerleader, his advisor, his safe harbor in every storm. The irony wasn't lost on me that the more successful Robert became, the less he seemed to need me. Success had made him confident, powerful, attractive to other people in ways that apparently made my contributions seem quaint and outdated. Somewhere along the way, I'd become part of the furniture in his life, as reliable and overlooked as the expensive artwork we'd collected over the years. Robert appeared in the kitchen exactly 32 minutes after I'd heard the shower start, his routine as predictable as sunrise. He looked good for 55, I had to admit. The gray at his temples only added to his distinguished appearance, and his personal trainer had kept him lean and strong. He wore a charcoal suit I'd helped him pick out 2 months ago, paired with a burgundy tie that brought out the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Good morning," he said, already reaching for his phone as he kissed my forehead. The gesture was so automatic I wondered if he'd even noticed he'd done it. "Big day today?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Robert's days were always big, always important, always requiring his complete attention. The Hartwell acquisition is finally moving forward. We're presenting the final terms to their board this afternoon. He scrolled through his emails while he talked, his attention already shifting away from our conversation. "I'll probably be late tonight, don't wait up. Don't wait up." When had that become his standard goodbye? When had we stopped eating dinner together, stopped talking about our days, stopped connecting in any meaningful way? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment our marriage had shifted from partnership to parallel existence, but the distance felt vast now, unbridgeable. "I might stop by the office today," I said casually, watching his reaction. "I need to sign those insurance papers for the employee's health plan renewal." Robert's fingers paused over his phone screen for just a moment before resuming their rapid movement. "Actually, that's not necessary. Jessica can handle the paperwork. She's been managing all the administrative details for the employee benefits. Jessica, his secretary, his assistant, his right hand in all things professional and, I was beginning to suspect, some things personal as well. Jessica Williams was 28, blonde, and possessed the kind of effortless competence that made her indispensable to Robert's daily operations. She'd been with the firm for 3 years, hired fresh out of Arizona State with a business degree and enough ambition to power a small city. "I don't mind handling it myself," I said. "I am still listed as the benefits administrator. Sarah, it's really not worth your time. Jessica has everything under control." The dismissal stung, though I tried not to show it. When had I become someone whose time wasn't worth anything? When had my involvement in Robert's business become an inconvenience rather than an asset? He grabbed his coffee, his briefcase, and his keys in one fluid motion, muscle memory guiding him through the same routine he'd performed thousands of times. "I'll see you tonight. Or tomorrow morning, depending on how late this runs." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the familiar hollow feeling that had become my constant companion. I sat in the perfect kitchen of our perfect house, surrounded by the perfect life we'd built together, and felt absolutely nothing. Maria emerged from the pantry where she'd been diplomatically busy during Robert's departure. She had a gift for avoiding our increasingly strained interactions, though I suspected she understood more about the state of our marriage than either Robert or I realized. "Will you be going out today, Mrs. Mitchell?" she asked, beginning to clear Robert's barely touched breakfast. "I think I will," I said, making the decision as I spoke. "I have some business to attend to downtown." The drive to Mitchell & Associates took me through the heart of Phoenix, past the neighborhoods where Robert and I had lived when we were young and hopeful, and convinced that hard work would guarantee happiness. The office building where his firm was housed rose 37 floors into the desert sky, a monument to success and ambition that Robert had pointed out to me countless times, as evidence of how far we'd come. I'd been coming to this building for over 15 years, long enough to know every security guard, every elevator operator, every receptionist who'd worked the front desk. They all knew me as Mrs. Mitchell, the boss's wife, and they treated me with the careful deference reserved for people who technically had no power but whose displeasure could theoretically cause problems. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," called Tommy, the security guard who'd been working the lobby since the firm moved into the building. "Mister?" Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mitchell didn't mention you were coming in today." "Last-minute decision," I said with a smile. "You know how it is." He nodded knowingly, though I suspected he knew very little about how anything was, really. I signed the visitor's log out of habit, though technically I wasn't a visitor. My name was still on several documents related to the firm, a fact that most people had forgotten over the years as my day-to-day involvement had diminished. The elevator ride to the 34th floor gave me time to observe my reflection in the polished steel doors. I looked older than I felt, though not as old as I sometimes feared. My auburn hair, professionally colored every 6 weeks, was swept into the kind of elegant chignon that had been my signature style for years. My clothes were expensive and well-fitted, chosen to project the image of a successful attorney's wife without appearing to try too hard. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, which was both a comfort and a cage. The law firm's reception area was designed to impress, all marble and mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the sprawling desert landscape beyond. The receptionist, a young woman named Brielle, who'd started 6 months ago, looked up with practiced professional interest. "Mrs. Mitchell, how lovely to see you. Are you here to see Mr. Mitchell?" "Actually, I'm here to handle some administrative matters. The employee benefits paperwork." Brielle's perfectly made-up face showed a flicker of confusion. "Oh, I think Jessica usually handles all of that. Should I let her know you're here?" "That won't be necessary. I know where everything is." I walked past the reception desk with the confidence of someone who belonged, even though I felt increasingly like an intruder in the empire I'd helped build. The hallways were busy, with associates and paralegals moving between offices, their arms full of files and their faces bright, with the kind of professional urgency that I remembered from my own brief legal career decades ago. Robert's office was at the end of the hall, behind double doors that bore his name in gold lettering. But I didn't head in that direction. Instead, I turned toward the smaller office adjacent to his, where Jessica Williams held court over Robert's schedule, his correspondence, and apparently his complete confidence. Jessica's office was immaculate, organized with the kind of military precision that Robert valued above almost everything else. She sat behind her desk, typing rapidly on her computer, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that somehow managed to look both professional and effortlessly beautiful. She was wearing a navy dress that probably cost more than Maria made in a month, and jewelry that caught the light when she moved. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, looking up with surprise that seemed genuine, "I didn't know you were coming in today." Spur-of-the-moment decision. "I need to review the employee benefits paperwork before the renewal deadline." Jessica's smile remained perfectly in place, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Actually, I've already taken care of all of that. The paperwork has been submitted and approved. There's really nothing for you to worry about." The casual dismissal was delivered with such practiced ease that I almost missed the underlying message. There's nothing for you to worry about. As if my involvement was unnecessary, burdensome, potentially problematic. "I appreciate your efficiency, Jessica, but I'd still like to review the documents. It's my responsibility as the benefits administrator." "Actually," Jessica said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "I think there might be some confusion about roles and responsibilities. Mr. Mitchell has been very clear that I should handle all administrative matters to avoid any complications." Complications. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. What kind of complications could arise from a wife reviewing paperwork for her husband's company? Unless, of course, there were reasons to keep that wife away from certain information. "I'm sure Robert appreciates your thoroughness," I said carefully, "but I'm not asking for your permission, Jessica. I'm informing you of what I intend to do." For just a moment, the professional mask slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something harder underneath. Jessica Williams was young and beautiful and competent, but she was also ambitious in a way that reminded me of myself at that age. The difference was that I'd channeled my ambition into supporting Robert's career, while Jessica seemed focused on building her own power base. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, her voice now carrying a note of barely concealed condescension, "I think it might be best if you stepped aside and let the people who understand these matters handle them. The business world has become very complex since you were actively involved." The words hit like a physical blow. "Step aside. Let the people who understand handle things. Since you were actively involved." Each phrase was carefully chosen to diminish, to exclude, to remind me that I was an outsider now in the world I'd helped create. I see, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. And you feel qualified to make that determination? I'm just trying to help, Jessica said, her tone suggesting that she was being very patient with a difficult person. I know how overwhelming all the legal and financial details can be for someone who isn't familiar with current business practices. The patronizing assumption that I was too old, too out of touch, too irrelevant to understand the complexities of business was breathtaking in its audacity. This woman who'd been with the firm for 3 years, who'd never built anything from scratch, who'd never sacrificed her own ambitions for someone else's dreams, was telling me to step aside. Thank you for your concern, I said, my voice arctic with control. But I think I can manage. I moved toward the filing cabinets where I knew the administrative documents were kept, but Jessica stood quickly, positioning herself between me and the files. I'm sorry, but I can't let you access those documents without Mr. Mitchell's explicit permission. It's a matter of company policy. Company policy. As if I were a stranger trying to access confidential information, instead of a woman whose signature was on the founding documents of this firm. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. I think you're overstepping your authority, Jessica. I think I'm protecting the firm's interests, she replied coolly. Which is what Mr. Mitchell pays me to do. The implication was clear. Robert paid her to protect the firm from people like me, people who might complicate the smooth operation of his business empire. When had I become a threat to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted? Before I could respond, I heard Robert's voice in the hallway, coming closer to Jessica's office. He was talking to someone about the Hartwell acquisition, his tone animated in the way it always was when he discussed deals that excited him. Should be finalized by Friday. The paperwork is already in motion, and I think we can announce the acquisition by the end of next week. He appeared in Jessica's doorway, still talking to Tom Henderson, one of the senior partners, and stopped mid-sentence when he saw me standing there. Sarah, what are you doing here? The surprise in his voice was genuine, but there was something else there too. Annoyance? Concern? It was hard to tell, but it definitely wasn't pleasure at seeing his wife in his place of business. I came to handle the benefits paperwork, I said, watching his face carefully. Jessica seems to think I need your permission to access files that are legally my responsibility. Robert's eyes flicked to Jessica, who straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with the confidence of someone who knew she had support. I was just explaining to Mrs. Mitchell that all the administrative matters have been handled, Jessica said smoothly. There's really no need for her to trouble herself with these details. That's right, Robert said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he wanted to end a conversation quickly. Everything's under control, Sarah. You didn't need to come down here. The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. My own husband was backing his secretary's decision to block my access to documents I had every legal right to see. More than that, he was treating my presence in his office like an intrusion, an embarrassment that needed to be managed and minimized. I see, I said again, though this time the words carried a different weight. I suppose I misunderstood my role here. It's not about roles, Robert said quickly, glancing at Tom Henderson, who was watching our exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether he should leave or stay. It's about efficiency. Jessica handles all the day-to-day operations now. It's just easier that way. Easier. For whom exactly? Easier for Robert to exclude me from decisions that affected our shared interests? Easier for Jessica to consolidate her power over every aspect of the firm's operations? Easier for everyone to pretend that my decades of contribution had never happened? Of course, I said, my voice perfectly controlled. I wouldn't want to interfere with efficiency. I turned to leave, but Jessica's voice stopped me at the doorway. Mrs. Mitchell? I looked back at her, noting the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I hope you understand that this is really for the best. The business world has changed so much, and it can be difficult for people who aren't actively involved to keep up with all the complexities. The condescension was no longer subtle. She was openly telling me that I was too old, too irrelevant, too out of touch to understand the business that I had helped build from nothing. And she was doing it in front of my husband and his partner, confident that they would support her position. "You're absolutely right, Jessica," I said quietly. "Things have become very complex. Much more complex than you might realize." I left the office with my head high and my face composed, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd walked into that building an hour ago had been someone who still believed in fairness, in loyalty, in the value of building something together with someone you loved. The woman who walked out was someone else entirely. The drive home passed in a blur of desert landscape and rush hour traffic. My mind was spinning, processing not just what had happened in Jessica's office, but everything that had led to that moment. How long had Robert been excluding me from decisions about the firm? How long had Jessica been positioning herself as the gatekeeper to my own husband's business? How long had I been sleepwalking through my own marginalization? At home, I went straight to my study, a small room off the main hallway that I'd claimed years ago when Robert had taken over the larger home office. My study was where I kept my personal files, my correspondence, the remnants of my own interrupted legal career. It was also where I kept the documents that most people had forgotten existed. I pulled out the file cabinet's bottom drawer and reached for a manila folder that I hadn't opened in years. Inside were papers that dated back to the early days of Robert's practice, when we were young and broke and convinced that we were building something together. Legal documents with both our signatures, partnership agreements that had seemed like simple formalities at the time, insurance policies, and incorporation papers that reflected the reality of our joint investment in Robert's dream. My hands were shaking as I spread the documents across my desk, but my mind was crystal clear for the first time in months. 23 years ago, when Robert had been a struggling attorney with big dreams and no capital, I'd done more than just support his ambitions. I'd invested my own inheritance from my grandmother's estate, money that had allowed him to rent office space, hire staff, and take on the kinds of cases that established his reputation. More importantly, I'd insisted on legal protection for my investment. The partnership agreement we'd signed made me a 25% owner of Mitchell & Associates, with full rights to financial information, strategic decision-making, and profit distribution. Over the years, as the firm had grown and evolved, that percentage had been diluted somewhat through additional partnerships and stock distributions, but I still owned a significant stake in the company. Robert had agreed to the arrangement readily back then, grateful for my financial contribution and confident that we'd be partners in every sense of the word for the rest of our lives. The legal documents had seemed like a formality, a technicality that would never matter, because we were a team, united in purpose and ambition. But life had changed our relationship, success had changed Robert, and time had changed everything except the legal reality of my ownership stake in the firm. A stake that Robert seemed to have forgotten about entirely, and that Jessica Williams certainly knew nothing about. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. Margaret Foster had been my law school roommate, a brilliant woman who'd chosen family law over corporate practice, and had built a reputation as one of the toughest divorce attorneys in Phoenix. We'd stayed in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and brief updates about our children, but we'd never been close friends. "Sarah Mitchell," Margaret said when she answered, her voice warm with surprise. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you?" "I've been better," I said honestly. "Margaret, I need to ask you a professional question, and I need complete confidentiality." The warmth in her voice shifted to professional attention. "Of course. What's going on?" If someone owned a significant percentage of a company, but had been excluded from management decisions and access to financial information, what would their legal options be? Margaret was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her lawyer's mind processing the implications of my question. "That would depend on the specific terms of the ownership agreement," she said carefully. "But generally speaking, minority shareholders have specific rights that can't be violated without legal consequences." "Sarah, are we talking about you and Robert's firm? Hypothetically, if someone had been systematically excluded from their legally protected role in a company, they could demand access to financial records, force a management review, or even petition for dissolution of the partnership if the situation was severe enough. And if that person discovered that decisions had been made without their knowledge or consent, that could constitute breach of fiduciary duty, depending on the circumstances. Sarah, I think you should come in and see me. Soon. I made an appointment for the following morning and hung up the phone, feeling more alert and focused than I had in months. The woman who'd been dismissed and patronized in Jessica Williams's office was about to become a very different kind of problem. That evening, Robert came home after 10 o'clock, as he'd predicted. I was in the living room reading when he walked in, his tie loosened and his face showing the fatigue that came from 12-hour days of high-stakes negotiations. "How did the Hartwell meeting go?" I asked, not looking up from my book. "Very well. We should have everything finalized by Friday." He poured himself a scotch from the bar cart and settled into his favorite chair. "Sorry about this afternoon. Jessica can be a little protective of the office procedures." She certainly can be. If Robert detected any edge in my voice, he didn't show it. He was scrolling through his phone again, checking emails that couldn't wait until morning. "She's been invaluable to the firm's operations," he continued absently. "I don't know what I'd do without her organizational skills. I'm sure she's very organized. The best assistant I've ever had. She anticipates problems before they arise, handles difficult situations with complete professionalism. Tom was just saying today how impressed he is with her business acumen. Business acumen, organizational skills, complete professionalism." The praise flowed easily, enthusiastically, in a way that Robert hadn't spoken about me in years. When had Jessica Williams become so indispensable to my husband's daily life? When had her judgment become more valuable than mine? "Robert," I said, finally looking up from my book, "when was the last time you and I talked about the firm's finances?" He glanced up from his phone, his expression mildly surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean the profit and loss statements, the cash flow projections, the partnership distributions. When did we last discuss any of that?" "Sarah, you've never been interested in the financial details. You always said you trusted me to handle the business side of things. I trusted you to include me in major decisions. There's a difference." Robert set down his phone and looked at me with the kind of patience that adults reserve for children who were asking questions beyond their understanding. "Honey, the business has become very complex over the years. The financial structures, the partnership agreements, the regulatory requirements. It's not something you need to worry about. That's what I have accountants and lawyers for." "And Jessica? Jessica helps coordinate all of that, yes. She's become very knowledgeable about the firm's operations." "More knowledgeable than I am?" "More involved in the day-to-day management, certainly." The casual dismissal was delivered without malice, which somehow made it worse. Robert genuinely believed that I was too removed from the business world to understand or contribute to discussions about the firm's direction. He'd written me off so completely that he couldn't even see the insult in his words. "I see," I said, returning to my book. "Well, I'm sure Jessica has everything well in hand." "She does," Robert said, missing the irony entirely. "I'm very lucky to have found someone so capable." He went back to his phone, and I went back to my reading, but neither of us was really focused on what we were doing. The conversation had revealed more than Robert realized, and less than I needed to know. But it was a start. Later that night, as Robert slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and thinking about partnership agreements and fiduciary duties, and the difference between trust and negligence. I thought about Jessica Williams's condescending smile, and Robert's casual dismissal of my business acumen. I thought about 23 years of building something together, only to discover that together had become a very relative term. But mostly I thought about the documents in my study and the appointment I had with Margaret Foster in the morning. Because if Jessica Williams thought I should step aside, she was about to learn that some people don't step aside so easily. Some people step forward instead. Margaret Foster's law office occupied the 15th floor of a sleek downtown building that competed with Robert's for the best view of the Phoenix skyline. I arrived 15 minutes early for our 10 o'clock appointment, partly out of nervousness, and partly because I'd been awake since 4 in the morning, my mind racing through scenarios and possibilities that ranged from vindication to complete humiliation. The receptionist, a woman about my age with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, offered me coffee while I waited. I accepted gratefully, my hands needing something to do besides shake. The waiting area was decorated in soothing blues and grays, with artwork that suggested competence without aggression. Everything about the space was designed to put nervous clients at ease, though I suspected most of Margaret's clients were dealing with more straightforward betrayals than mine. "Sarah?" Margaret appeared in the doorway to her office precisely at 10 o'clock, and I was struck by how little she'd changed since law school. Her dark hair was shorter now, streaked with silver that she wore with confidence, and her figure had softened with age and motherhood. But her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her formidable in constitutional law debates 25 years ago. "You look exactly the same," I lied as she embraced me briefly. "And you look like someone who hasn't slept," she replied with typical directness. "Come in. Tell me what's really going on." Margaret's office was larger than I'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts and framed photographs of what I assumed were her children at various ages. Her desk was organized but not obsessively neat, covered with case files and legal pads that suggested a busy practice. She gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk while she settled behind it with a fresh legal pad. "Before we start," she said, "I want to be clear about something. Whatever you tell me today is covered by attorney-client privilege, even if you decide not to retain my services. You can speak freely." I nodded and opened the folder I'd brought with me, spreading the partnership documents across her desk. Margaret put on reading glasses and began examining the papers with the methodical attention that good lawyers brought to important documents. I watched her face as she read, noting the subtle changes in expression that suggested she was finding exactly what I'd hoped she would find. "Sarah," she said after several minutes, looking up from the documents, "do you understand what these papers represent?" "I think so. But I'd like you to explain it to me in plain English." Margaret leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers, her expression shifting into what I recognized as her teaching mode from our law school study sessions. "According to these documents, you own 18% of Mitchell & Associates, not 18% of Robert's personal assets, not 18% of some subsidiary company, but 18% of the actual law firm that bears his name. I thought the percentage might have decreased over the years as new partners were added. It has, but not as much as you might think. The original agreement included anti-dilution provisions that protected your stake when new equity was distributed." Very smart lawyering, by the way. "Who drafted these documents?" "Robert did, actually. We couldn't afford outside counsel at the time." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "He protected your interests very thoroughly. This agreement gives you significant rights as a minority shareholder, including access to financial records, participation in major business decisions, and a voice in strategic planning. But I haven't been involved in any of those things for years. That's a problem. A big problem, from a legal standpoint." Margaret picked up one of the documents and pointed to a specific clause. "This provision requires that all partners be notified of major business decisions and given the opportunity to participate in discussions." "When was the last time you were consulted about a significant transaction?" I thought about Robert's excitement over the Hartwell acquisition, his casual mention that the deal would be finalized by Friday. "Never. Robert handles all the business decisions." I thought that was normal. "It's normal for a spouse to trust their partner's judgment. It's not normal, or legal, for a business partner to be systematically excluded from decisions that affect their financial interests." Margaret made notes on her legal pad as she spoke. "Tell me about yesterday. What exactly happened at the office?" I recounted the entire encounter with Jessica, from her initial dismissal to her final condescending lecture about the complexity of modern business. Margaret's expression grew darker as I described Robert's support of Jessica's position and his casual dismissal of my right to access files. "This Jessica Williams," Margaret said when I finished. "How long has she been with the firm?" 3 years. And she's making decisions about your access to company documents." "Apparently. Robert seems to have given her complete authority over administrative matters." Margaret set down her pen and looked at me directly. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe there's a personal relationship between your husband and his secretary? The question hung in the air between us, forcing me to confront suspicions I'd been trying to ignore for months. Robert's increasingly late nights, his distraction during our few conversations, his glowing praise for Jessica's capabilities. The way she'd positioned herself as a gatekeeper between Robert and the rest of the world, including me. I don't know, I said finally. I've wondered, but I don't have any proof. Proof isn't necessary for our purposes today. What matters is that your legal rights as a partner are being violated, regardless of the motivation. Margaret pulled a fresh legal pad from her desk drawer and began writing. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to draft a formal demand for access to all company financial records, partnership distributions, and major transaction documents for the past 5 years. This demand will cite your ownership rights and the specific provisions of the partnership agreement that require transparency. What if Robert refuses? He can't legally refuse. If he does, we can petition the court for an order compelling disclosure. But I don't think it will come to that. Robert's a smart lawyer. He knows he's in violation of the partnership agreement. Margaret continued writing as she spoke, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Second, we're going to request copies of all amendments or modifications to the original partnership agreement. If your percentage has been diluted without your knowledge or consent, that's a serious breach of fiduciary duty. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means Robert could be personally liable for any financial harm you've suffered as a result of his actions. If the firm has been profitable and you haven't received your share of distributions, he could owe you significant money. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If I owned 18% of a successful law firm and hadn't received dividends or profit sharing in years, the accumulated value could be substantial. Third, Margaret continued, we're going to establish your right to participate in all future business decisions. No more exclusions. No more being told that matters are too complex for you to understand. You're not just Robert's wife in this context. You're his business partner, and you have legal rights that trump his personal preferences. I felt something loosening in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For months, I'd been accepting Robert's dismissals and Jessica's condescension as somehow justified, as evidence that I really had become irrelevant and out of touch. But Margaret was treating my concerns as legitimate, my rights as real and enforceable. How long will this take? I asked. That depends on how cooperative Robert is. If he provides the requested documents promptly and acknowledges your partnership rights, we could resolve this within a few weeks. If he chooses to fight, Margaret shrugged. That could take considerably longer and cost significantly more. I'm not concerned about the cost. Margaret looked up from her writing, studying my face carefully. Sarah, I need to ask you something else. What's your goal here? Are you trying to save your marriage, or are you preparing to end it? The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since yesterday's confrontation. What did I want from this situation? Did I want Robert to apologize, to change, to somehow return to being the man who'd valued my partnership all those years ago? Or was I simply tired of being dismissed and marginalized, ready to claim my power regardless of the impact on our relationship? I want respect, I said finally. I want to be treated like the partner I legally am, not like an inconvenient spouse who needs to be managed and dismissed. And if that damages your marriage beyond repair? I thought about Robert's casual dismissal of my business acumen, Jessica's condescending lecture about stepping aside, the years of feeling invisible in my own life. Then maybe the marriage was already damaged beyond repair, and I just hadn't admitted it yet. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's a healthy perspective, and it gives us clear objectives for moving forward. She spent the next hour walking me through the legal process, explaining my rights as a partner and the remedies available if those rights continued to be violated. The conversation was both empowering and terrifying, opening up possibilities I'd never considered while forcing me to confront the reality that my marriage might not survive this assertion of independence. By the time I left Margaret's office, I had a clear action plan and a copy of the demand letter that would be delivered to Robert's office that afternoon. Margaret had offered to handle the delivery personally, but I'd insisted on taking care of it myself. This was my fight, and I wanted to control how it began. The drive back to Paradise Valley gave me time to think about timing and strategy. Robert would be in meetings all afternoon, preparing for the Hartwell acquisition announcement. He wouldn't see Margaret's letter until late in the day, which meant I'd have several hours to prepare for his reaction. Based on 23 years of marriage, I could predict exactly how that reaction would unfold. First, he'd be confused, unable to understand why I was suddenly asserting rights I'd never cared about before. Then he'd be annoyed that I was complicating his business operations during a crucial period. Finally, he'd be angry that I'd hired a lawyer without discussing it with him first, framing my actions as a betrayal of our marital trust. What he wouldn't expect was my complete indifference to his emotional manipulation. The woman who'd walked out of Jessica Williams's office yesterday had left behind the need for Robert's approval or understanding. I was no longer interested in being managed, dismissed, or patronized. I was interested in being respected, and if Robert couldn't provide that willingly, the law would compel it. At home, I found Maria in the kitchen preparing lunch. She looked up when I entered, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested she'd sensed the tension in our household, even if she didn't understand its source. "How was your morning, Mrs. Mitchell?" "Productive," I said, settling at the kitchen island with the files I'd brought home from Margaret's office. "Maria, I may be having some difficult conversations with Mr. Mitchell over the next few days. I want you to know that whatever happens, it has nothing to do with you or your job here." Her dark eyes showed concern, but she nodded professionally. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Mitchell. Is there anything I can do to help?" "Just keep doing exactly what you've been doing. You've been wonderful." I spent the rest of the afternoon in my study, organizing documents and making notes about the questions I wanted to ask once I had access to the firm's financial records. The partnership agreement entitled me to 5 years of profit and loss statements, cash flow analyses, and distribution records. If the firm had been as successful as Robert's lifestyle suggested, my 18% stake represented significant accumulated value. More importantly, I wanted to understand the structure of Robert's recent deals. The Hartwell acquisition that had consumed so much of his attention, for instance. Had I been consulted about the risks and benefits of that transaction? Had my partnership rights been considered when the deal terms were negotiated? If not, I might have grounds to challenge the entire arrangement. At 4:30, my phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it go to voicemail. He called again 5 minutes later, then again at 4:40. By 5 o'clock, he'd left 3 increasingly urgent messages asking me to call him immediately. I didn't listen to any of them. At 5:15, Jessica Williams called. I almost laughed at the audacity. The secretary who told me to step aside yesterday was now trying to reach me directly, presumably to manage whatever crisis my legal demand had created. I didn't answer that call either. At 6 o'clock, Robert came home. I heard his BMW in the driveway, followed by the slam of the front door and his rapid footsteps across the marble foyer. He found me in my study, surrounded by legal documents and financial projections. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, waving Margaret's letter in the air. His face was flushed with anger, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "It's a formal request for access to information that I'm legally entitled to have," I said calmly, not looking up from the spreadsheet I was reviewing. "You hired a lawyer. You hired Margaret Foster to threaten me?" "I hired Margaret to represent my interests as a partner in Mitchell & Associates. If you interpret that as a threat, perhaps we should examine why." Robert moved closer to my desk, his posture aggressive in a way that might have intimidated me yesterday. Today, it simply confirmed that I'd made the right decision. "Sarah, this is insane. We're married. We're supposed to be a team. You don't hire lawyers to fight your own husband. Teams communicate, Robert. Teams make decisions together. Teams don't systematically exclude members from important discussions." I finally looked up at him, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he held Margaret's letter. "When was the last time we made a business decision together? You've never been interested in the business decisions. You always said you trusted me to handle things. I trusted you to include me when my financial interests were affected. I trusted you to respect the partnership agreement we both signed. I trusted you not to let your secretary make decisions about my access to company information. The mention of Jessica seemed to hit a nerve. Robert's jaw tightened, and he looked away from my direct gaze. Jessica has nothing to do with this. She was just following standard procedures. Standard procedures that exclude business partners from accessing their own company's records. That's interesting. I'd like to see those procedures in writing. Sarah, you're being ridiculous. This whole thing is blown completely out of proportion. I stood up from my desk and faced him directly, noting that we were the same height when I wasn't unconsciously deferring to his presence. Am I? Yesterday, your secretary told me to step aside because I wasn't qualified to understand the complexities of modern business. You supported her position. Today, I'm asserting my legal rights as a partner in the firm that bears your name. Which part of that is ridiculous? Robert ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times over the years. But this time, I wasn't moved by his distress. His comfort was no longer my responsibility. The partnership agreement is a technicality, Sarah. It was something we did 23 years ago when we were young and didn't know any better. It doesn't reflect the current reality of how the firm operates. Legal agreements aren't technicalities, Robert. They're binding contracts that create enforceable rights and obligations. You should know that better than anyone. But it was never meant to be used this way. We never intended for you to actually exercise those rights. The admission hung in the air between us, more revealing than he'd probably intended. Robert had agreed to make me a partner when he needed my money, but he'd never expected me to actually act like one. In his mind, the partnership was a convenient fiction that could be ignored once it was no longer useful. I see, I said quietly. So my partnership rights were real when you needed my money, but they're technicalities now that you don't. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. You just can't hear yourself saying it. Robert set Margaret's letter on my desk and sat down heavily in the chair across from me. For the first time since he'd stormed into the study, he looked less angry than confused. Sarah, I don't understand what's happening here. Yesterday we were fine. Today you're hiring lawyers and making demands about partnership rights you've never cared about. What changed? What changed? As if my transformation had happened overnight, as if years of gradual marginalization had suddenly crystallized into legal action for no reason. As if Jessica's condescending dismissal had been an isolated incident rather than the culmination of a long pattern of exclusion. What changed is that I finally understood how you see me, I said. Not as a partner, not as an equal, but as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and inclusion you're willing to provide. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked my opinion about a major business decision? When was the last time you shared financial information about the firm? When was the last time you treated me like someone whose judgment you valued? Robert was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him mentally reviewing our recent interactions, perhaps recognizing for the first time how completely he'd excluded me from the business side of his life. I was trying to protect you from stress, he said finally. The business world is competitive and complicated. I thought you'd prefer to focus on other things. You thought I'd prefer to be irrelevant. That's not what I meant. But it's what happened. And it's what your secretary clearly believes. She was so confident in your support that she felt comfortable telling me to step aside, to let the people who understand these matters handle them. Robert's face darkened at the mention of Jessica again. I'll talk to her about that. She was out of line. Was she? Or was she simply reflecting the attitude you've modeled for 3 years? The question hit its mark. Robert looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since he'd arrived home, shifting in his chair and avoiding my direct gaze. Sarah, what do you want from me? What will it take to resolve this without involving lawyers and making everything adversarial? I want exactly what Margaret's letter requests. Full access to financial records, partnership distributions, and major transaction documents. I want to be consulted about significant business decisions. I want to be treated like the partner I legally am. And if I agree to that, then we proceed as business partners who happen to be married, instead of as a husband who tolerates his wife's occasional interference in his important work. Robert stood up and began pacing around my small study, his restless energy filling the space with tension. I remained seated, watching him process the implications of my demands. "The other partners won't understand this," he said finally. "Tom Henderson, David Reeves, they'll think you're trying to interfere with firm operations. The other partners will have to adjust their understanding of the firm's ownership structure. I assume they're all lawyers. They should be capable of reading partnership agreements. But you don't know anything about the day-to-day operations. You haven't been involved in years. Then it's time for me to get involved. I'm a smart woman, Robert. I have a law degree from the same school you attended. I helped build this firm from nothing. I think I can manage to understand whatever complexities have developed in my absence." The condescension in his voice was so automatic that I doubted he even heard it himself. But I heard it, and it strengthened my resolve to follow through with Margaret's legal strategy. "This will change everything," he said, stopping his pacing to face me directly. "Everything changed yesterday, when your secretary told me to step aside and you supported her position. I'm just making the change official." Robert left my study without another word, and I heard him making phone calls from his home office down the hall. His voice was low and urgent, but I caught fragments of conversation that suggested he was calling other partners, probably Tom Henderson, possibly the firm's outside counsel. Good. Let him scramble to understand the legal implications of the situation he'd created. Let him explain to his colleagues how he'd managed to forget that his wife was actually his business partner. Let him deal with the complexity and stress he'd been so eager to protect me from. At 8 o'clock, Maria announced that dinner was ready. Robert and I sat at opposite ends of our dining room table, making stilted conversation about our children and the weather, while carefully avoiding any mention of the crisis that had consumed our afternoon. It was a masterclass in marital dysfunction, two people who'd shared a bed for 23 years, reduced to the awkward politeness of strangers. "I talked to Emma today," I said, cutting into the salmon that Maria had prepared. "She's excited about her internship this summer." "That's nice," Robert replied absently, his attention clearly elsewhere. "She asked if we were planning a family vacation this year. I told her I wasn't sure what our schedule would look like." "Our schedule?" "Well, yours might be quite busy with legal proceedings if you choose not to comply with Margaret's request." Robert set down his fork and looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time in years. Not affection, not warmth, but a recognition that I was no longer someone who could be dismissed or managed. "You're really going to do this," he said. "You're really going to blow up our marriage over partnership rights." "I'm going to claim what's legally mine, Robert. If that blows up our marriage, then our marriage was built on a foundation that couldn't withstand equality." After dinner, I retreated to my study while Robert made more phone calls. I could hear his voice through the walls, alternating between anger and frustration as he tried to find a way to resolve the situation without actually addressing its underlying causes. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Jessica Williams again. This time, I answered. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Jessica. I hope I'm not calling too late." Her voice was carefully modulated, professional but with an undertone of urgency that suggested she was operating outside her comfort zone. "Not at all, Jessica. How can I help you?" "I wanted to talk to you about what happened yesterday. I think there may have been some misunderstanding about my role at the firm." "I don't think there was any misunderstanding. You made your position quite clear. I was just trying to help streamline the administrative process. I never meant to suggest that you weren't entitled to access company information." The lie was smooth and practiced, but it lacked conviction. Jessica was clearly working from a script, probably one that Robert had provided after consulting with his lawyers. "That's interesting," I said, "because what you actually said was that I should step aside and let people who understand these matters handle them. You also said that the business world had become too complex for someone who wasn't actively involved. I think you may have misinterpreted my comments." "I have an excellent memory, Jessica. Would you like me to repeat your exact words?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her regrouping. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I have tremendous respect for you and everything you've contributed to Mr. Mitchell's success. I would never intentionally disrespect you. And yet you did. The question is whether that disrespect reflected your personal attitude or the culture that Robert has created at the firm. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean that employees tend to reflect the values and priorities of their supervisors. If you felt comfortable telling me to step aside, it's because someone taught you that my input wasn't valuable. Another pause, longer this time. When Jessica spoke again, her professional mask had slipped slightly. Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you understand that I'm just trying to do my job effectively. Mr. Mitchell relies on me to handle certain administrative matters so he can focus on legal work. And apparently, one of those administrative matters is limiting my access to company information. That's not. I was just following standard procedures. Procedures that exclude business partners from accessing their own company's records. Yes, we've established that. What I'm curious about is who established those procedures. Jessica didn't answer, which was answer enough. Robert had created a system that marginalized me, and Jessica had simply been following his lead. The question was whether she'd done so out of professional obligation or personal interest. Jessica, I said, I want you to understand something. Tomorrow, Margaret Foster will be requesting 5 years of financial records from the firm. As an 18% partner, I'm entitled to review all major transactions, partnership distributions, and strategic decisions. This process will happen whether you cooperate or not, but your level of cooperation will determine how disruptive it becomes. I understand, she said quietly. Do you? Because yesterday you seemed quite confident that I could be dismissed and ignored. Today, you're calling me at 10 o'clock at night to manage a crisis that threatens the smooth operation of the firm. What changed? Mr. Mitchell explained that you have certain legal rights as a partner. Legal rights that you were apparently unaware of when you told me to step aside. That's either incompetence or willful ignorance, Jessica. Either way, it suggests that you don't understand these matters as well as you claimed. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Jessica promising to cooperate fully with any requests for information. I doubted her sincerity, but it didn't matter. Margaret's legal demand would compel cooperation regardless of Jessica's personal preferences. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. 48 hours ago, I'd been a woman who accepted dismissal and marginalization as the natural order of things. Tonight, I was someone who'd hired a lawyer, asserted partnership rights, and forced both my husband and his secretary to acknowledge my legal standing. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, like a building that collapses slowly and then all at once. Years of accumulated resentment and diminished expectations had crystallized into decisive action, triggered by Jessica's casual suggestion that I step aside. Robert came to bed after midnight, his movements careful and quiet in the darkened room. We lay beside each other in silence, both pretending to sleep while our minds raced through the implications of the day's events. The physical distance between us felt symbolic of something larger, a chasm that had been growing for years and had finally become too wide to ignore. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin the formal process of asserting my partnership rights. Robert would have to decide whether to cooperate or fight, whether to acknowledge my legitimate role in the firm, or continue the fiction that I was just a wife who needed to be managed and dismissed. Whatever he decided, I was no longer the woman who would accept his choice without question. I was no longer someone who could be told to step aside. I was a partner, legally and finally emotionally, and I intended to act like one. The woman who'd been dismissed in Jessica Williams's office 2 days ago was gone. In her place was someone who understood the difference between being included and being tolerated, between being valued and being managed. Someone who'd finally learned that respect wasn't something you asked for politely. It was something you claimed with the full force of the law behind you. The financial records arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered to Margaret's office in 3 large banker's boxes that represented 5 years of Mitchell & Associates' most closely guarded secrets. I spent the drive downtown wondering what I would find in those documents, whether my suspicions about the firm's success and my exclusion from its benefits would be confirmed, or whether I'd discover that Robert had been protecting me from financial disappointment rather than hiding financial success. Margaret had cleared her conference room for our review session, and she'd brought in 2 associates to help analyze the mountain of paperwork that Robert had been legally compelled to provide. The young lawyers, both women in their early 30s, treated the documents with the kind of reverence usually reserved for archaeological artifacts. They understood that we weren't just reviewing financial statements, we were uncovering the architecture of systematic exclusion. Before we dive into the numbers, Margaret said, settling at the head of the conference table with her reading glasses and several yellow legal pads, I want to prepare you for what we might find. Based on my preliminary review of the partnership agreement and the firm's public filings, Mitchell & Associates has been significantly more profitable than Robert has led you to believe. I opened the first box and pulled out a thick folder marked Partnership Distributions 2019 to 2024. The documents inside were meticulously organized, each year separated by colored tabs, each quarter's distributions documented with mathematical precision. As I scanned the numbers, a pattern emerged that was both shocking and infuriating. The firm had distributed over $12 million in partner profits during the past 5 years. My 18% stake should have entitled me to over $2 million in distributions during that period. According to the documents in front of me, I had received exactly $0 in partnership distributions. Not a reduced amount, not a delayed payment, but nothing at all. Margaret, I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in my chest. Am I reading these numbers correctly? She looked up from her own stack of documents, her expression grim. If you're seeing what I think you're seeing, then yes, you're reading them correctly. And it's worse than we thought. One of the associates, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer, had been reviewing the major transaction files. She looked up from a particularly thick folder with an expression of professional outrage. Mrs. Mitchell, were you consulted about the Blackstone merger in 2022? I've never heard of the Blackstone merger. It was a $40 million acquisition that expanded the firm's corporate practice into California and Texas. According to these documents, it required unanimous partner approval. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Show me. Jennifer spread the merger documents across the table, pointing to signature pages that bore the names of every partner except mine. Robert had signed on my behalf, using a power of attorney that I'd never granted, and that had apparently been forged using my signature from other documents. This is fraud, Margaret said flatly, examining the signature page through her reading glasses. Robert forged your consent to a major business transaction that significantly increased the firm's value and your personal stake in its success. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Robert hadn't just excluded me from partnership distributions, he'd actively deceived me about major business decisions that affected my financial interests. The husband I'd trusted to handle business matters had been systematically stealing from me for years. There's more, said the other associate, a young man named David who'd been reviewing the most recent financial statements. The Hartwell acquisition that Mr. Mitchell has been working on? It's structured as a stock deal that will dilute all existing partnership percentages. Mrs. Mitchell's 18% stake will drop to 12% when the deal closes, and she wasn't notified or consulted. I stood up from the conference table and walked to the window, looking down at the Phoenix skyline where Robert was probably in his office right now, preparing for the Hartwell announcement. He was planning to reduce my ownership stake by 1/3 without telling me, probably assuming that I'd never find out or that I wouldn't understand the implications if I did. How much money are we talking about? I asked, not turning away from the window. Conservatively, you're owed $2.4 million in past distributions, Margaret said. But that's just the beginning. If the partnership agreement violations constitute breach of fiduciary duty, you could be entitled to punitive damages and legal fees. We're looking at potential exposure in excess of $5 million. $5 million. The number was so large that it felt abstract, like a lottery prize that belonged to someone else. But it was real, and it represented years of my husband treating me like a fool while he enriched himself and his partners at my expense. What about the forged signature on the Blackstone merger? I asked. That's a felony, Margaret replied. Document fraud in connection with business transactions carries serious criminal penalties. But more importantly for our purposes, it voids the entire merger agreement. If we can prove that Robert lacked authority to sign on your behalf, the Blackstone deal is legally invalid. The room felt charged with possibility and danger. We weren't just talking about recovering money that was rightfully mine, we were talking about unwinding major business transactions and potentially sending my husband to prison. The woman who'd been told to step aside by his secretary had the power to destroy everything he'd built. I need to think about this, I said, returning to the table but not sitting down. I need to understand what happens if we pursue every legal remedy available to us. Margaret nodded understandingly. If we file criminal fraud charges and petition to void the Blackstone merger, Mitchell and Associates will face immediate crises. The California and Texas offices will likely revert to their previous owners, the firm's valuation will plummet, and Robert could face disbarment proceedings in addition to criminal charges. And the other partners, Tom Henderson, David Reeves, and the other equity partners, will see their investments decimated. They'll probably sue Robert personally for damages, and the firm could face bankruptcy if the litigation exposure becomes too great. I thought about Tom Henderson, who'd been present when Jessica dismissed me from accessing company files. I thought about David Reeves, who'd never once asked my opinion about firm strategy despite knowing I was a partner. I thought about all the partners who'd benefited from my exclusion while treating me like decorative furniture at firm social events. What about Jessica? I asked. That's interesting, Jennifer said, pulling out another folder. Ms. Williams has been receiving what appear to be discretionary bonuses that aren't documented in the standard employee compensation records. Over the past 2 years, she's received almost $300,000 in payments that are categorized as, quote, special project consulting fees. Special project consulting fees. For a secretary. The euphemism was so transparent that it was almost insulting. Robert had been paying Jessica hundreds of thousands of dollars for services that had nothing to do with filing documents or managing his calendar. I want to see the documentation for those payments, I said. David handed me a folder containing bank transfer records and payment authorizations. Every payment to Jessica bore Robert's signature and was coded to obscure its true nature. But the pattern was clear. Regular monthly payments that exceeded many lawyers' salaries, all flowing to the woman who'd told me to step aside. Margaret, I said, what would happen if I exercised my right to call for a partnership meeting to discuss these irregularities? As an 18% partner, you have the right to demand an emergency meeting with all equity partners. Given the nature of the violations we've uncovered, such a meeting would be legally required within 7 business days. I smiled for the first time since we'd started reviewing the documents. Then let's call a meeting. The partnership meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at 10 o'clock in the main conference room at Mitchell & Associates. Margaret had drafted a formal agenda that listed every violation we'd discovered, every forged signature, every unauthorized payment, every distribution that should have been made to me but wasn't. The agenda read like an indictment, which was essentially what it was. Robert had spent the weekend trying to reach me, calling my phone every few hours and leaving increasingly desperate messages. I didn't return any of his calls. There was nothing left to discuss privately. Everything that mattered would be said in front of his partners, with legal counsel present and court reporters documenting every word. On Monday morning, I dressed carefully for what I knew would be the most important business meeting of my life. I chose a navy suit that projected authority without aggression, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that conference room, someone who couldn't be dismissed or marginalized. Margaret and I arrived at Mitchell & Associates at 9:30, early enough to set up our materials and establish our presence before the other partners arrived. The conference room was the largest space in the firm, with a mahogany table that could seat 20 people and windows that offered commanding views of downtown Phoenix. It was designed to impress clients and intimidate opponents, but today it would serve as the venue for Robert's reckoning. Tom Henderson arrived first, his usual confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. He'd probably spent the weekend trying to understand how a routine partnership meeting had turned into what his lawyers had undoubtedly told him was a potential catastrophe for the firm. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I hope we can resolve whatever concerns you have without damaging the firm's relationships with our clients. That will depend entirely on how honestly you and your partners address the violations that have been occurring," I replied. David Reeves and the other equity partners filed in over the next few minutes, each greeting me with the kind of forced politeness that people used when they weren't sure whether they were dealing with a colleague or an adversary. Robert entered last, his face gray with stress and exhaustion. He avoided making eye contact with me, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. Margaret called the meeting to order and began reading from her prepared statement, her voice clear and professional, as she outlined the scope of the violations we'd uncovered. With each revelation, the partners' faces grew paler, their occasional glances at Robert shifting from confusion to anger to what looked like panic. The partnership agreement signed in 2001 granted Mrs. Mitchell 18% ownership of Mitchell & Associates, Margaret continued. This ownership entitled her to regular financial reports, consultation on major business decisions, and proportional distribution of partnership profits. For the past 5 years, none of these obligations have been met. Tom Henderson cleared his throat. Sarah, we all assumed that you'd chosen not to participate in firm operations. Robert indicated that you preferred to focus on family matters. Mr. Henderson, Margaret replied before I could speak. Mrs. Mitchell's personal preferences don't void her legal rights as a partner. The partnership agreement doesn't include provisions for voluntary exclusion from profit distributions. She opened the first exhibit folder and distributed copies of the partnership distribution records to each person at the table. The silence that followed was profound, as the partners absorbed the reality of what they were seeing. Over the past 5 years, Margaret continued, Mrs. Mitchell has been denied $2.4 million in partnership distributions that were legally hers. These funds were instead redistributed among the other equity partners, effectively diluting her ownership stake without her knowledge or consent. David Reeves was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger. Robert, is this accurate? Have we been receiving Sarah's distributions? Robert's response was barely audible. The situation is more complicated than these documents suggest. It's actually quite simple, Margaret said, opening the second exhibit folder. Mr. Mitchell forged Mrs. Mitchell's signature on the Blackstone merger documents, committing felony fraud while exposing the firm to potential liability if the transaction is voided. The revelation hit the table like a bomb. Several partners began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a chaos of recrimination and panic. Tom Henderson's face had gone from pale to red, and David Reeves was staring at Robert with undisguised fury. The Blackstone merger represents 40% of our current valuation, Tom said, his voice shaking. If that deal is voided, we'll face immediate bankruptcy. That's not our primary concern, Margaret replied coolly. Our primary concern is recovering the money that was stolen from Mrs. Mitchell and ensuring that her partnership rights are respected going forward. I hadn't spoken since the meeting began, but now I felt the weight of every eye in the room. These men had excluded me for years, treating me like an irrelevant spouse who could be safely ignored. Now they were waiting to hear whether I would destroy their careers and their firm to claim what was rightfully mine. I've been coming to this building for 15 years, I said finally, my voice steady and clear. I've attended your holiday parties, your client dinners, your celebration events. You've all shaken my hand and asked about my children, and commented on my dress or my hair. But not one of you has ever asked my opinion about firm strategy, included me in partnership discussions, or acknowledged that I had any legitimate role in the business that bears my husband's name. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Last week, Robert's secretary told me that I should step aside and let people who understand these matters handle them. She was confident that Robert would support her position, and she was right. Yesterday, I learned that while you've all been treating me like decorative furniture, you've been stealing millions of dollars from me. I stood up from the table and walked to the windows, looking down at the city where I'd spent my entire adult life building something I thought was ours but had apparently been theirs all along. The question now is what happens next, I continued, not turning back to face them. Margaret has outlined several legal options available to us. We can file criminal fraud charges that will likely send Robert to prison. We can petition to void the Blackstone merger, which will probably bankrupt the firm. We can sue for punitive damages that will personally destroy every partner who benefited from my exclusion. When I turned back to the table, several of the partners looked like they were going to be sick. Robert was staring at his hands, apparently unable to meet anyone's gaze. Or, I said, returning to my seat, we can discuss terms for my voluntary withdrawal from the partnership in exchange for appropriate compensation and a commitment that this firm will never again systematically exclude a partner from their legal rights. Tom Henderson leaned forward eagerly. What kind of terms are you considering? Full payment of past distributions owed, plus interest and legal fees. Immediate cessation of all irregular payments to Jessica Williams. A formal admission that partnership protocols were violated. And Robert's resignation from all management positions in the firm. The last condition landed like another bomb. Robert's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You can't seriously expect me to give up the firm I built, he said, speaking directly to me for the first time since the meeting began. You built it with my money, Robert. You expanded it using forged signatures. You enriched yourself by stealing my distributions. The question isn't whether you should give up management, it's whether you should be allowed to remain a partner at all. Margaret opened her final exhibit folder, revealing bank records that documented the payments to Jessica Williams. These transfers totaled $297,000 over 2 years. They're coded as consulting fees, but there's no documentation of any consulting work performed. What exactly was Jessica consulting about? I asked. Though we all knew the answer, Robert's silence was answer enough. The man who dismissed my business acumen and supported his secretary's suggestion that I step aside had been paying that same secretary hundreds of thousands of dollars for services that had nothing to do with legal work. David Reeves was the first partner to break ranks. Robert, this is indefensible. You've exposed the firm to criminal liability and civil damages that could destroy everything we've built. I move that we accept Mrs. Mitchell's terms immediately. One by one, the other partners voiced their agreement. They understood that their choice was simple: sacrifice Robert to save the firm, or watch everything collapse in criminal proceedings and civil litigation. It wasn't really a choice at all. The settlement negotiations took 3 hours to complete, with Margaret and the firm's outside counsel working through the details, while I sat in the conference room watching Robert's empire crumble around him. By the end of the afternoon, I had agreements that would pay me $4.2 million in cash, transfer full ownership of our Paradise Valley house to my name alone, and require Robert's immediate resignation from all firm management positions. More importantly, I had something that money couldn't buy: the satisfaction of watching everyone who'd dismissed and marginalized me scramble to appease the woman they'd treated as irrelevant. As the meeting concluded and the partners filed out, Robert remained in his seat, staring at the settlement documents that had just ended his career as managing partner of the firm that bore his name. 23 years, he said without looking up. I spent 23 years building this firm. We spent 23 years building it, I corrected. You spent the last 5 years stealing from me. The payments to Jessica, they weren't what you think. I laughed, the sound harsh in the empty conference room. Robert, I don't care what those payments were for. I care that you made them with money that belonged to me while your secretary was telling me to step aside. He finally looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. What happens to us now? There is no us anymore, Robert. There's you, dealing with the consequences of your choices, and there's me, finally free to make my own. I left him sitting alone in the conference room where he'd held court for over a decade, surrounded by the mahogany and marble monuments to success that would now belong to other people. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like a descent from one life to another, each floor representing another layer of the past that I was leaving behind. In the parking garage, Margaret handed me the settlement check and the deed to my house. $4.2 million and complete ownership of the place where I'd spent my marriage building someone else's dream. What will you do now? She asked. Whatever I want, I said, the freedom of that answer almost overwhelming. For the first time in 23 years, whatever I want. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my villa in Sedona, watching the red rocks catch the morning light while I sipped coffee that I'd learned to make exactly the way I liked it. The house in Paradise Valley had sold within a week, purchased by a tech executive who appreciated its clean lines and mountain views. I'd kept only a few pieces of furniture and the books that had always been more mine than ours. The villa was smaller than the Paradise Valley house but felt more spacious, designed around my preferences rather than Robert's need to impress clients and colleagues. I had a garden where I grew herbs and vegetables, a studio where I was learning to paint, and a home office where I managed the investment portfolio that Margaret had helped me establish. The money from the settlement had grown substantially under professional management, enough to fund the kind of life I'd always imagined but never thought I could afford. More importantly, it was money that belonged entirely to me, earned through my own courage, rather than someone else's generosity. I'd heard through mutual friends that Robert had moved to a smaller apartment downtown, that Jessica Williams had left the firm shortly after the settlement was finalized, and that Mitchell and Associates had quietly removed Robert's name from the letterhead. The partners had survived the crisis, though their relationships with each other remained strained by the knowledge of how close they'd come to losing everything. Robert had tried to contact me several times in the months after our divorce was finalized, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to something approaching desperate. I'd listened to each message once before deleting it, curious about his emotional evolution, but unmoved by his attempts to rewrite history or negotiate forgiveness. The woman who'd been told to step aside was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect wasn't something you requested politely but something you claimed with the full force of your own power. I'd learned that the greatest betrayal wasn't Robert's theft of my money or his relationship with Jessica, but my own willingness to accept marginalization as the price of domestic peace. On this particular morning, as I watched the Sedona sunrise paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, my phone rang with a call from an unknown Phoenix number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over caution. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Jessica Williams." The voice that had told me to step aside 6 months ago now carried a note of uncertainty that suggested the caller was no longer confident of her welcome in any conversation. "Hello, Jessica. What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize for what happened at the firm. I know I was out of line, and I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. The apology was carefully worded, probably rehearsed and utterly meaningless coming 6 months after Jessica had lost her lucrative position and whatever security she'd thought her relationship with Robert provided. "I appreciate the call," I said, "but I'm not interested in relitigating the past. I understand, I just wanted you to know that I never meant to disrespect you personally. I was just trying to do my job." "Your job was to facilitate my husband's theft of millions of dollars from me?" "That's not. I didn't know about the financial issues. I was just managing administrative matters." "You were managing administrative matters that included telling me to step aside, while Robert paid you nearly $300,000 for consulting services? What exactly were you consulting about, Jessica?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I began to wonder if she'd hung up. "I should go," she said finally. "I just wanted to apologize." "Jessica," I said before she could end the call, "do you know what I learned from our interactions?" "What?" "I learned that when someone tells you to step aside, you should always ask yourself what they're afraid you'll see if you step forward instead." After she hung up, I sat on my terrace thinking about the chain of events that had led from Jessica's dismissive comment to my current life of independence and self-determination. If she hadn't been quite so condescending, if Robert hadn't been quite so supportive of her position, if I hadn't been quite so tired of accepting marginalization as normal, none of this would have happened. But it had happened, and I was grateful for every moment of pain and humiliation that had finally forced me to examine the legal documents that had been gathering dust in my study. The partnership agreement that Robert had probably hoped I'd forgotten had become the instrument of my liberation and his accountability. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, who'd become more friend than attorney in the months since the settlement. She was forwarding an article from the Phoenix Business Journal about Mitchell and Associates' recent struggles with partner departures and client defections. The firm that had once dominated the local legal market was discovering that reputation, once lost, was difficult to rebuild. I deleted the article without reading it. The fate of Robert's firm was no longer my concern, and their struggles couldn't add to my satisfaction in having claimed what was rightfully mine. I was done looking backward, done measuring my happiness against other people's misfortune. Instead, I opened my laptop and began working on the memoir I'd started writing about the experience of discovering your own power after decades of accepting someone else's definition of your worth. The book would probably never be published, but writing it had become a way of processing the transformation from invisible wife to empowered woman. The title page bore a simple dedication to every woman who's ever been told to step aside and who chose to step forward instead. As the desert sun climbed higher in the cloudless Arizona sky, I smiled and continued writing, documenting the journey from marginalization to vindication with the same methodical attention to detail that had uncovered Robert's years of systematic theft. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation, with families reunited and marriages saved. This wasn't one of those stories. This was a story about justice delayed, but not denied, about the price of treating partnership as a convenience rather than a commitment, about the dangerous assumption that intelligent women will accept dismissal indefinitely. Most importantly, it was a story about what happens when someone finally stops stepping aside and decides to step forward instead, armed with legal documents that everyone had forgotten but no one could ignore. The woman who'd been told she didn't understand the complexities of modern business had understood them perfectly. She'd understood that respect was earned through power, that marriage didn't void partnership rights, and that sometimes the most devastating response to condescension was simply to read the fine print. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.